Hey guys, welcome back to another lecture. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about soft tissue injuries. I'm going to start by talking about the anatomy and physiology of the skin. So the skin is the body's largest organ. It actually has three layers. You can see in this picture it has the epidermis, which is what is on the outside. It's what we see. It's got the dermis, which is the next layer underneath. And then underneath that, it has the subcutaneous fatty tissue. And then you can see some of the different structures contained in these different layers here. So at the very top, this is really just a lot of dead skin cells. Some of the hair, you have the hair shaft coming up, but there's not really much to the epidermis. It's really primarily for protective measures. The next layer is the dermis, and you have the blood vessels. You do have a few nerve roots that come up into this layer, and kind of the top part of this sweat gland here is in the dermis, but it's really kind of further down into the fatty tissue. And then you come down to the next layer, and you have a lot more structures. You have some bigger arteries. You have, like I mentioned, this fatty tissue, which helps provide padding and that sort of stuff. Your sweat glands are down here, and the roots to the hairs are down in this layer as well. The skin is a very complex system, and it performs a variety of functions. It lets us sense things like heat and cold and pain. It controls water loss. We have a lot of water inside our bodies, and our skin creates a barrier to keep us from losing water. It protects us against microbes. Again, it's a barrier. It keeps everything that's supposed to be in, and keeps everything that's supposed to be out. And it helps us with temperature control. This is actually kind of a big deal. If we didn't have any skin, we would run around and we would lose a lot of heat. And our body needs to keep that heat in to keep all of the body's different processes working correctly. So soft tissue injuries can either be a closed injury, meaning the skin has not been breached, or an open injury, which means the skin has been breached. So closed injury, this is associated with blunt trauma. So if you take and accidentally hit your thumb with a hammer, that would be a blunt trauma. The skin remains intact, so there's no cuts, there's no breaks in the skin, but damage occurs below the surface. The types here are contusions and hematomas. This is an example of a contusion. This is produced when blunt force damages the dermal structures, and blood and fluid leak into the damaged area and cause swelling and pain. The presence of blood under the skin causes the skin discoloration, and the word for this, which you'll need to know, is called ecchymosis. Ecchymosis is the fancy word for a bruise. A hematoma is a blood lump. You can see it's a goose egg. It's where you actually have a collection of blood under the skin because you have a larger blood vessel that's been damaged. It causes a mass of blood to collect in the injured area, and a fist-sized hematoma equates to a 10% volume loss. Now that's the patient's fist. So a hematoma the size of the patient's fist is about a 10% volume loss into that space. Now you think in volume loss, what does that really mean? So we have a certain amount of blood that circulates around in our body. And when that blood is no longer in the blood vessels, it is lost. And it could be still inside the body, but just not in the blood vessels. It's still a volume loss. A crush injury is when you have a body part that's subject to a high degree of force. This results in bruising, bleeding, something called compartment syndrome, possible lacerations, and possible fractures. And I think the best way to think about it is that each of your little areas in your body are compartments. They are all somewhat connected, but not a whole lot. So if this is your leg and your foot, I know it's kind of a silly drawing, but that's the leg, right? And then it comes up, and you've kind of got the rest of your body up here. I'm a terrible drawer. Okay. If you have your leg crushed, for example, it may fracture this bone. Ultimately, what happens with the crush is you've got a heavy force applied to this leg, for example. It occludes off all of the blood flow in and out. So normally blood is going to come down through the arteries, perfuse down to the foot, and then go back up to the heart via the veins. But when you crush it, blood flow is basically cut off to the area of injury. So nothing down here has any blood flow in or blood flow out. So of course you're going to get bruising. You're potentially going to get bleeding if you, internal bleeding certainly, because you're going to damage some of the blood vessels. You're going to rupture them. Compartment syndrome happens when you release this, so you uncrush it, and then you've got your, your leg back to normal. So, no, that's a terrible foot. So your leg's no longer crushed. The problem is everything swells up. You have a ton of swelling in here because you have that bruising. So everything down here that was crushed swells up. Well, that swelling now does the same thing, or basically the same thing, that the crush injury did. It occludes off those blood vessels. Your leg gets so swollen that you no longer can get blood in or blood out. Although it's easier to get blood in, so a lot of times that can create an even bigger problem, is that you can get blood into the area of injury but not out. So that's compartment syndrome in a nutshell. Lacerations, of course, are cuts, and fracture is where the bone is broken. So when you're faced with a closed tissue injury, what you really need to think about is how much blood is tied up in that injury rather than circulating in the vessels. You still have bleeding, it's just the skin hasn't broken, so it's not coming out anywhere. What could the force that caused the soft tissue trauma have done to the underlying organs? So if we go back to, where's our guy? If we go back to this, what happened? This is his rib cage here, right? He's got ribs. He's got, let's see, that's his right side. So he's got a liver here. There's his liver. He's got some intestines up under here as well. So what happened? And a kidney back here. So what happened to those organs? Are they damaged? So how do we assess a closed soft tissue injury? Assess for pulse, movement, and sensation distal to the injury. So if you go back to my guy with the leg injury, what we want to assess is if we have an injury here, then we want to assess pulse, movement, and sensation distal to the injury, so in his foot. We also want to assess for signs and symptoms, any discoloration or ecchymosis. Oops. Any swelling, any pain. As far as closed injury management, closed soft tissue injury management, RICEs. We want to rest, ice, compress, elevate, and splint. And this is going to help the blood and fluids that are going to accumulate under that closed injury. It's going to help them drain. When in doubt, assume that the underlying fractures are present. So think about the structures underneath, and we can't do x-rays in the field, so we certainly have to at least take them in for evaluation to see if they have some sort of fracture underneath.